You ever spoke with somebody who seems to have gotten saved on an installment plan? They can't pinpoint an exact time and date. Instead, there's this long process of God bringing them into salvation. Well, if you've met that person or if you are that person, then they have a lot in common with John Bunyan. I'm Bryan Catherman with SaltyBeliever.com, and I want to talk a little bit about John Bunyan's book, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Now, I read it on my Kindle, so I can't show you the cover very easily. John Bunyan was a Puritan preacher. He lived between 1628 and 1688. He was in prison for over 12 years on and off, and he's the famous author of Pilgrim's Progress, which I'm also going to talk about here in a moment. But this particular book is his autobiography. I wouldn't say it's his complete autobiography, but it really spends a lot of time focusing on a specific time of his life where he struggled to understand his salvation. And it seems as if years were going by when he was up, he was down, he was understanding, he wasn't, he was struggling, which is why I want to recommend the book. The book is Grace Abounding by the Chief of Sinners. It was published in 1666 for the first time, and it's been published by many publishers. I'd recommend you get it maybe from the Banner of Truth Publishing, or you can look for this book under its other title, which is A Brief Relation of the Exceeding Mercy of God in Christ to His Poor Servant, John Bunyan. How's that for a title? Or you'll find it by the title, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. John Bunyan, in this book, spends a lot of time wrestling through his own emotions and his own challenges and his own intellectual struggles as he was coming into faith. And then the latter part of the book talks about just many of the other things he dealt with as a preacher who was jailed for his faith, for preaching without a license, because he couldn't get licensed, because he didn't conform to the right aspects of the Church of England. It goes into a lot of the interpersonal realities of his life. It's really an interesting read. Now you have to remember, 1666, it's going to have some, maybe what we'd call old-timey or Puritan-y type language, but it is a wonderful and enjoyable read, especially if you've ever struggled or wrestled through kind of what God's doing in your life and why. Now, the other thing you see in Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners is a bit of the background. If you've read Pilgrim's Progress, you can see how this life poured into that book. And it's sad to me, a lot of people have really not picked up Pilgrim's Progress. They haven't taken a look at it. This was, at one point, maybe still is, the second best-selling book in the world, second only to the Bible. It was wildly popular. Charles Spurgeon read it every year. Many, many, many people will recommend it to you, as will I. And when people say, oh, it's just old, it's old historical stuff, I'm not interested, I just want to point out, I brought some stuff from my bookshelf. I mean, you have the classic look of Pilgrim's Progress in kind of that old English language. Yes, that's great, but you can also pick it up in a copy like this, where you have parts 1 and 2, because the first part is about Pilgrim who journeys on, Christian who journeys on to find his faith and end up in the eternal city, and then his wife and kids in part 2, Christiana, and this contains both parts, and it's put in modern English. So it's very helpful, has some footnotes, some things that help. I love this. I've read it a couple of times. It's fantastic. But it doesn't just end there. It was the backdrop for this recent movie, which is great. Doesn't hit everything like the book does, and it only covers part 1. But The Pilgrim's Progress, based on John Bunyan's epic masterpiece. And this is put out, Kristen Getty and a few others put this together. But it's just the Pilgrim's Progress movie. It's fantastic. But check this out. I mean, we think, oh, it's just old history, but here's a Marvel comic book about the story of Pilgrim's Progress, and it contains part 1 and part 2. Sadly, in part 2, it made it out as if Christiana was going to the eternal celestial city to see her husband, but in fact, she was seeking her Lord. And so it missed a few pieces there. It's a beautiful and wonderful story that I would highly recommend reading. It's an allegory and it's fantastic. The reason for this recommendation, though, is about John Bunyan's autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. You can pick this up, really, you can find it for free, actually. If you Google it on the internet, you can download electronic versions of it. You can buy copies from different publishers. Banner of Truth has this, and it's a beautiful cover. They've helped to just clean up a little bit of that language to make it a little bit easier to read. I would highly recommend you look for this book. You pick it up, you read, and you find yourself blessed by this oak of a Christian who came before us and his fantastic words to encourage us into the gospel. The book is Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners by John Bunyan.